Hello and welcome to this new episode of Daughters of Narcissistic Mothers podcast. Today I want to start with asking you a question, or a few actually. So here we go. Do you constantly second guess yourself? Do you go back and forth on your decisions, unsure if you're making the right ones? Is there a voice in your head constantly telling you how not good enough you are? Do you often feel like the least interesting person in the room? The one that has to work the hardest to be liked? Or do you feel like the least qualified for whatever it is you would like to do? If your answer is yes to any of these questions, then you're very familiar with self-doubt and you know how crippling it can be to constantly being unsure of yourself. And I truly get that. I really do. That voice in my head saying I'm not good enough used to run my life completely. And self-doubt is something I still deal with daily. Today I want to speak to this topic as it is a very important one. I do get a lot of requests on this, and I know from my clients that is something that it's with us all the time. So if you feel like you're the only one in the room constantly doubting yourself, it's important that you know that that fact could not be the farther from the truth. I don't have a single client who doesn't struggle with self-doubt. And as I mentioned, it is something I deal with daily in my own life. I can't, of course, speak for everyone on this, but what I can say to you is that as daughters of narcissistic mothers, we all carry a degree of self-doubt within, and it impacts our lives more than we're comfortable showing usually. So you are definitely not alone in this. So where does all this self-doubt come from? Let's have a quick look at how a narcissistic mother behaves. First of all, it's important to understand that a narcissistic mother is actually crippled with shame, inadequacy, and self-doubt herself. This drives her behavior from her subconscious. She will never admit to it, of course, or show any of that. So there's no point in telling her because she'll say no all the way to her grave. But in order to never feel her own inner discomfort, she will do anything to get her needs met. And this means she will do what is necessary to control and manipulate her children so that they will fill up her tank in the way she needs. A narcissistic mother doesn't see her child as a separate individual, but as an extension of herself, as something that belongs to her and that can be used as she sees fit. In order to achieve that, she has to make sure the child never grows into an independent adult, or else she'll lose that control. So how does she make sure of that? Through different forms of manipulation. And I'm just going to name a few, like criticizing all the time, saying things like, it's just like you to make such a mess, or you are never going to be able to succeed at that. She can be using gaslighting, telling you things like, it's only you that sees it that way, it's all in your head, you silly girl. She can belittle you, saying things like, you think what you say is so important, but it's just a lot of nonsense. Luckily, I warn you, or you would have made a fool of yourself. Thanks God I know you so well. She can see doubts, saying things like, are you sure you want to do that? I wouldn't. I know what will happen if you actually go through with it. Or she can use a manipulation called infantilizing, treating you like a child even though you're a full adult. She can place emphasis on how not good you are compared to others, so using comparison to show your shortcomings or what she thinks are your shortcomings. She can take credit for your successes or also ignoring them altogether. So you could be extremely proud of something you've done, and either she tells you, well, it's just in your genetics, I mean, you're my daughter after all, or she could ignore it and dismiss it as if it was nothing. Shaming you for your mistakes. So anytime that something doesn't go like you had planned, which happens, that's life. I mean, we all make the so-called mistakes, and they are lessons, and we learn from them. But with a narcissistic mother, we get a lot of shaming for any little, small, teeny, tiny mistake. And finally, blaming you for all that goes wrong. So that's also known as scapegoating, but anything goes wrong, it's your fault, no matter what. Has any of this been part of your experience? I know it definitely has been a part of mine, and also of many listening in, I know that. So how I'm just always still talking about self-doubt, and we're getting to how all of this is tied in together, and how then we can counteract that self-doubt. The title of this episode is the number one antidote to self-doubt. So we're gonna get there soon, I promise. But what's the impact that all of this manipulation that we just mentioned has on us as daughters of narcissistic mothers? So what all of that brings is lack of confidence, a constant fear of failure. Because of course, if you were shamed every time you made a little mistake, you're gonna be really afraid of failing. Lack of trust in your own abilities, people-pleasing patterns, unsatisfiable need to be accepted and liked that can lead to toxic relationships, chronic perfectionism, and chronic procrastination. Because if I don't do it, I won't get criticized for it. So it's better to just, procrastinate as much as possible. There is an episode on procrastination if that is something that you're particularly struggling with. If you go back through all the episodes, I can't remember now the exact number of the episode, but it is, procrastination is in the title, so you can find it. And again, is any of this part of your lived experience? Do you feel any of that? Lack of confidence, the fear of failure, lack of trust in your abilities, people pleasing, unsatisfiable need to be accepted and liked, chronic perfectionism, chronic procrastination. And if you do feel any of that, share it with me. You can share it with me via email. You can share your experience and any questions. The email is always in the description of the episode. With all of that said, what does learning to deal with self-doubt mean? How do we learn to deal with it? It means not to let self-doubt run your life anymore. It means regaining control of your life. And how do we do that? I will share that antidote with you in a moment. But first, it's important to have a look at the root cause of self-doubt. And that is the wound of rejection. All the manipulation tactics I mentioned earlier, the criticizing, the infantilizing, the gaslighting, and so on, are forms of rejection from your mother. She's rejecting a part of you. A narcissistic mother rejects her child as an independent, growing individual, meaning she rejects you as a person unless you fit in with her list of criteria and demands to meet her need or her needs. A narcissistic mother's love is conditional, and you only ever get it if you fit in with her needs. And this is not just in cases of like a mother neglecting her children. There's an obvious rejection. She's just gone, she's abandoned us, or she doesn't want to have anything to do with us. Okay, that's a very obvious rejection. But all of those manipulations that I've mentioned, they are deep down forms of rejections. She's rejecting a part of you. She's rejecting the part of you that grows, that is wanting to grow, the part of you that wants to express, the part of you that wants to make mistakes and try again. All of those aspects of you are being rejected. There's only one part of you that you learn. That's a coping strategy. We learn to show only the part that gets somewhat the least rejected. I won't even say that gets accepted, but the least rejected. And this pattern of rejection, when activated, leads to all that I just mentioned. So the need to be accepted, the lack of trust in your abilities, the people pleasing, and all the rest that goes with self-doubt. The fundamental step to shift this pattern is to understand that each moment you're doubting yourself, you are actually rejecting a part of yourself. So you are keeping this pattern of rejection active within yourself by setting conditions to your likability, to your lovability, to your capacities as a person. You end up rejecting that part of you that wants to grow, to try, to fail and to try again, the part that would grow and develop to an independent individual, and to grow and develop your own identity. That's what you're rejecting within yourself when that pattern is active. Now, is that because you're broken or inherently bad? Absolutely not. I am not going to say that enough. Absolutely not. Always be very kind with yourself. This is a very, this pattern is a very wise part of your system that has created a way to cope with all that you have experienced growing up with a narcissistic mother. It's very important. It's a lot less painful to reject yourself than to be rejected by your own mother or by others you love. So this mechanism that it's a protective strategy that we put in place, and of course it's subconscious. You're not consciously knowing you're doing that. And I am right there with you. I mean, I've been doing that for years, so there's no judgment here, as always. It's just to understand it's really important, because this way the control goes back with you. You know, as long as we think that we have this fear of rejection because of our mothers, but it is the blame is somehow directed at our mothers, like she's done this to us, so we're never going to be able to stop this craving and need to be liked and accepted, and this crippling self-doubt and all of that. We can't actually do anything about it, because I mean, that has happened to us. Our mothers did behave this way, and we can't change that. But when you realize that the mechanism, the pattern is actually within yourself, that self-doubt that keeps going on is actually a continuation of that rejection pattern, and it's a protective strategy, because if you somehow subconsciously, preemptively reject yourself, you're sparing yourself from the pain of being rejected, which that subconscious part of you feels is inevitable, because that's what you've been shown by your mother growing up. And remember, when we're growing up, when we're small children, our mother is the entire world. So if she's rejecting us, then the entire world is going to reject us. That's what we grow up believing. That's the conditioning. Okay? So again, is it your fault? Absolutely not. It's not your fault. None of it is your fault. Okay? You're not broken. You're not bad. None of it is your fault. As I mentioned earlier, you're not alone. And it didn't start with you. None of this started with you. But now you have the power to end this. So how? How do we do that? And here we're getting to the antidote. Rejection is counteracted by acceptance. The antidote to the wound of rejection, and by extension to the pattern of self-doubt, is to practice radical self-acceptance. Okay, radical self-acceptance. And I said practice because it does need to be practiced. The pattern of rejection is the one you have received years of training in. Okay, it's like very well rooted in there. It's very well practiced. We know how to reject ourselves to a T. So now it's time to retrain your system with acceptance. How do we do that? How does this work in a practical way? So first of all, you want to become aware of how the pattern of self-doubt and self-rejection manifests within you. When does it get triggered? How does it feel in your own body? What story is your mind telling you when this pattern gets triggered? That's important, because there is a story that her mind tells, and usually we believe it to be 100% true. And you may notice how the story is along the same lines each time. So it's really important to become aware of that story. I want to give you an example here. So I wasn't getting anywhere work-wise for a long, long time. As in, I was starting a lot of different jobs, if you want to call them that. I was very often self-employed. Only a few times I've actually worked for other people, but each time I was getting to a point of it being within reason successful, getting places, beginning to show results, and I was quitting, and I was stopping, and I was just abandoning the whole thing. That self-doubt, that fear of not being good enough, fear of making mistakes, and it was showing up with a story. The story in my head was always of blame of others. It was others people's fault all the time if I quitted. There was always a reason coming from the outside. So that was the first story that I realized I was telling myself. And the story usually has layers. So the more you become aware of what story your mind is telling you, the more you will figure that there are layers to it. You will find layers. So the first layer was the blame of others. And then after that, I realized that there was that story of me not being good enough, because of course I wasn't aware of that at the beginning. And the story underneath that was that if I did anything good, that I actually really invested myself in, that my heart was there, it was going to be taken away from me. Because that did happen very often in my life because of my mother. I do speak to that in the episode about working for your narcissistic mother. My own experience working for my mother and her taking away, in a way or another, all the things that I had created, and it was very painful. So that was the other story. If I do something great, it's going to be taken away from me some way or another. And then underneath that, there was a story of hopelessness. There is no hope for me. So you see, like, how getting aware of what story your mind is telling you, none of those stories were actually valid. They seem really true in the moment, but they're stories that are connected to the past, and they're not actually relevant to what was happening in my life in that specific moment. I was just self-sabotaging myself, but the stories that were alive were related to the past, and yet they felt so true, and they were controlling my life. So again, that was just to give you an example of what happens when you actually start understanding the pattern within you and finding out what story is your mind telling about that in that moment when you get triggered. It's really important. Again, there's no judgment. Whatever is the story that your mind is telling you, that's just information. I say that very often, but that's what it is. That's just information. You receive that information and you acknowledge that that is just a story, and then see where that goes next. You're not trying to fix anything. You're not trying to fix yourself, of course, because there's nothing to fix. You're just understanding yourself and getting to know yourself better in a way that supports you in shifting on from this pattern. So once you realize what is the story that you're telling, then you can ask yourself, when did you start telling that story to yourself? Because that allows you to go back to that past moment when that story became activated. Now, sometimes this is very clear, and sometimes it's not that clear. So again, don't get too caught up if you can't get the specific moment. But very often that does happen. So that's the first part, the becoming aware of all of it. So again, just to recap, you start to become aware of the pattern of self-doubt and self-rejection. When does it get triggered? How does it feel in your body? That's important. What story is your mind telling? And when did you start telling yourself that story? You can journal about this, you can reflect on it, whatever way it works. You can talk about it with your therapist, or you can share it in the women's circle if you're part of the women's circle. Um, and we have been working on that quite a bit within the women's circle, actually, on the recognizing of the story and how that affects and impacts our life. So then after all of this, the second step is, now that you can recognize it, when you feel yourself going down that path, so when you feel that the pattern of self-doubt and self-rejection has been triggered, ask yourself, what part of you are you rejecting? And take time to practice acceptance of that part of yourself. So when I was afraid of when I was blaming others, actually what I was rejecting was the part of me that could make mistakes. I was not accepting that I could just make mistakes, and that's allowed, that's part of life, that's part of growing, that's part of learning new trades. That I was not accepting that. I could not ever make mistakes, because that, again, was very unsafe for myself growing up. So there was a story attached to that. So that's what I was rejecting. I'm now practicing radical acceptance every time that I meet an obstacle or that I make a mistake, because I do, even in the running of this business. I mean, I'm going to, there's going to be times that I'm going to use the wrong words at the wrong time, or that I'm going to mess up with technology or whatever. There are going to be mistakes, and that's okay. But that's what I'm talking about. So to give you an example. So the part that we reject is usually some part of our inner child. So some part of your inner child that hasn't felt safe, seen, or loved, that now is looking for that. And that's why she's coming back full force. And so to practice acceptance of that part, once you have identified it and felt it, you can say to that part of yourself, it's okay to feel what you're feeling. I've got you. I will never leave you for that. I'm never going to abandon you or reject you for that. You're okay. You know, that part of me that was so scared of making mistakes, that's fine. It's okay to be afraid to make a mistake. Here, like, I'm going to hold you by the hand and we're going to do this together. And if you get it wrong, that's fine. We're going to try again. Which is ultimately what we would have wanted or needed from a mother that was not narcissistic. And we didn't get that. That's okay. So you're learning to mother that part of yourself with acceptance rather than constant rejection. So send acceptance to the inner child in you that feels afraid of being rejected for failing at something, that is hurting for past rejections, that feels undervalued and unlovable. Practice mothering your inner child with acceptance and a love that is unconditional. And it needs to be practiced. I didn't know what that looked like. I didn't know what acceptance was. I've never seen it modeled in my family. There was zero acceptance of anything. I had to dig really, really, really deep to actually find what that meant. And I am grateful to the mentors and guides and beautiful people along the way that have shown me glimpses of it so that I could then practice that in my own way. So again, you don't have to do this alone. Make sure you have the right support around you to practice this. People that actually do accept you. That really helps, you know. And again, that's where mentors, women's circles, places like that are safe containers created on purpose are really, really helpful. Now, when you practice the acceptance of that part of you that has felt rejected for so long, when you practice to love it unconditionally, that part of you that felt rejected all this time will feel seen and validated and will stop controlling your life. Does that mean you will never feel self-doubt again? As I said, I still deal with it every day, but it doesn't run my life. I do feel it. I know it's there. I know when the pattern starts. I know how it feels in my body. I've learned to know it very intimately, and to accept that again, that part that feels as self-doubt, if we hate it, we're rejecting it. If we want it to stop and it's like, that's it, I hate that part of myself, that's a rejection. So I've practiced to accept it, and it's part of me. It's a part. It's not the totality of me, but it is a part. So again, that's an invitation. View it as a part of you and accept that part. And then hold that inner child by the hand. And it's okay if you're having doubts about this. That's fine. You're doing something new. You're doing something different. You're trying something you haven't tried before. So having doubt is quite normal, actually. That's fine. It's natural. That's what you can say to that part of you, to that inner child that feels that self-doubt. But now we're going to do this together. Whatever happens, we're going to be fine. Because ultimately, usually the worst case scenario that the self-doubting part is picturing is actually never going to happen. That's like we just tend, that part tends to go to the absolute worst case scenario, but that actually never really happens. So practice that, and you'll see that you will learn to allow that inner child to be there and feel whatever it is to be felt, but without running your life. The inner child is not going to be in the driving seat anymore. So the antidote to the wound of rejection is acceptance. And you are the most qualified person to give that to yourself. We're seeking that outside of ourselves all the time. We're constantly looking for acceptance from others. But ultimately, the biggest, most powerful, most amazing, most nourishing acceptance comes from within. The most powerful source of acceptance is within you. And from there, you will find it in others too. Because when you radically accept yourself, unapologetically, unconditionally, radically accept yourself, and very few people do that. And when they do, you know it. We all get like, wow, that person is just so incredibly grounded and so confident. There's something about that person. We can feel that. So when you radically accept yourself, you're gonna start receiving that from others too. And you're not gonna be needy anymore. So you're not gonna start down toxic relationships and toxic friendships and weird um, codependent messy stuff that doesn't actually support your system, because you're not going to be needy anymore. You're going to find that acceptance from others coming quite natural to you. And if someone doesn't accept you for who you are, well, then they're just going to not be in your life, because you will have your boundaries there, and you'll be fine that way too. So acceptance. If you felt rejected by your mother, and that has caused you to live with self-doubt all this time, the solution to that, the antidote to that, is radical self-acceptance. And again, reach out if you have any questions on this. You're super welcome to send an email. Also, if you found this episode helpful, I really appreciate when you leave a review, or you write it in the comments below. That always helps, because it helps the episode gaining importance, and then more women that need to hear it and get the chance to listen to it. So that's amazing when you do that. Thank you so much. And if you feel called to work with me, the details of the women's circles and of the one-on-one program are always in the description of the episode, so you can go check it out and reach out if you have questions. So with that, I'm going to leave you and send you lots of love. Bye for now. And I forgot to mention to keep an ear out for a special episode coming out this Thursday with Antoinette McQueenie as a guest. Antoinette is an homeopath specializing in women's hormonal health and menstrual educator, and together we're having a very powerful conversation about womb healing, about the menstrual cycle and all the shame and the lack of education, really, and the trauma that is connected with it, and it affects and impacts quite deeply the way we experience our menstrual cycle and all that is connected to that, and how homeopathy can really, really be a help. As daughters of narcissistic mothers, this topic is really, really important, as many of us did not receive the support that we needed from our mothers at the time when our cycle started and afterwards. And many of us have been shamed. Many of us couldn't talk about it. So we're covering a lot in this special episode that comes out on Thursday. So make sure you check it out when it comes out. Okay, that's it for today. Bye.